everybody. It is Christine Garvin, and welcome to the 2019 Hormone Summit. I hope you've been enjoying our interviews so far. We've had some amazing interviews before today, and then today I'm really, really excited about who I'm talking with, because she is so beyond knowledgeable about so many things when it comes to hormones, but specifically she really understands functional lab testing, which is such a useful tool when you're trying to figure out what in the world is going on with your hormones. So her name is Robin Randisi, and she's actually located in New York, and she sees clients both online and in person, and her specialty is really helping women in their 20s and 30s with period problems and pelvic pain and autoimmune conditions. And she does this from a functional approach. She is really incredible to work with, so I highly recommend contacting her. And we're gonna dive into one of her specializations today, which is, as I mentioned, functional lab testing. So welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for having me. And
yeah,
what a lovely introduction.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited that you're here and talking to us about this, because I really do think it's so important that a lot of women don't even understand that there's lab testing for their hormones, because I feel like their doctors don't bring that up to them, or if they do, it's kind of like, it's just part of this regular test that they do. And they're like, oh, everything's fine. Everything's, in the range or whatever. And yet women are having all of these issues. So, tell me about lab testing and really how it can help women.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's really important in order to fix something, I think you have to know what's going on. And so that's where lab testing comes in. I don't think it's the be all end all of everything, because you have to take someone's symptoms and context into the bigger picture when you're approaching a plan for them. But gosh, it can be so useful to see on paper what's going on. And also sometimes for certain people, for their motivation, for their own understanding, seeing results on paper can be really helpful. So, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about the different kinds of testing options for hormones, or how I use it, in my practice. But did that answer the question?
Absolutely.
General answer.
Well, and I think that I'm glad you brought up that point, that, seeing things on paper can be really helpful for us sometimes, because otherwise it's just this, this idea, and we don't necessarily want to make big changes in our lives if it's just this idea, right? And so when you have that concrete information, you're like, okay, so now I gotta make some shifts and changes. So yes, I would love to hear about, if you can tell us all about the different types of lab testing and what you use and find in your practice.
Sure. I just think I want to reiterate, that was a really good point. It makes this abstract concept of hormones and hormone balance a lot more concrete for people. So that's pretty useful. So there's three main ways to test your hormones if we're talking about sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which is what I'm going to assume, most people are here for.
Yeah.
And that's blood, urine, and saliva. So I can kind of mention a few things about each of those. Most people are probably familiar with blood, serum testing, and that's what you would get at your conventional doctor. This is the most commonly run test for hormones. So it does have some drawbacks, but that's probably what most people are used to getting. And do you want me to kind of go through the sort of pros and cons of each?
I would love that.
Okay.
I think it would be really, really helpful for a lot of people to understand that.
Okay, so while I'm talking about testing your hormones through blood, I'll just mention, like, the pros are you can get at your doctor's office, probably covered by insurance, and those are nothing to sniff at. Like, that's pretty nice. But it measures the total production of the hormone. So that can be good if you want to know total production, but what it doesn't tell us is what the free bioavailable hormone is, like how much is floating around in your bloodstream that's actually available to bind to the receptor sites. So instead, it's measuring everything that's bound to a protein, which is how hormones get around in the blood. So, you could have a situation where potentially you have hormone testing that looks normal, but the free levels are actually low, and that's where your symptoms coming from. So that can be one of those, just a simple scenario where your doctor's like, you're fine, your levels are fine, and you're like, but why am I still having symptoms? So
Can
that
I
can
ask you a
be,
quick question before you go?
yeah.
So I know this has happened in my personal experience with clients where the doctor either won't understand that they need to test on certain days, or like, for instance, this just happened with a client. They tested her estrogen on day 3 and then her progesterone on day 21 or 19.
Right. Yeah.
And I think her FSH, and then they didn't test testosterone or anything. So anyways, what happens in those situations?
Yeah, so in order to get an accurate assessment of what serum test is looking for, you have to know what you're testing for, and you have to know where you are in your cycle and what day it would be good to do that. So yes, so like estrogen and FSH, that's a pituitary hormone that talks to your ovaries and tells it to start maturing follicles, and then those follicles are producing estrogen. So those two things are usually measured day 3, and then you have very low progesterone in the first half of your cycle. It doesn't really make sense to measure it then if you want to get an idea of what's going on. So we usually wait till mid-luteal phase, like the second half of your cycle, right in the middle there. And that would be an appropriate time to measure progesterone. So yeah, that could be a kind of a con of the test. You really have to know, was this done on the right day? And I've had the same thing with clients, and I'm like, well, you got this test done and your progesterone's like nothing. What day of your cycle was it? And they are like, I don't know. And I was like, well, did your doctor ask you? No. So it's, if you don't know where you are in your cycle, then we can't really do much with the value. So
Right.
There's that piece of it too. And it's kind of always surprising to me when people order blood work like through their doctor and that's not taken into account. So
Right. Would you recommend that they'd also do estrogen at the same time they did progesterone, days 19 through 21, to see what the ratio looks like between the two of them?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah. Yeah, it really depends what your doctor's open to ordering for you and what's going on. So that's another way people do it. Ideally, you could have both. I mean, in a super ideal world, you could have your whole cycle, but who's going to go in like every other day and get their blood drawn from one period until their next period starts?
Right. Yeah.
But luckily, we have these other forms of testing where you can kind of map out the whole cycle and you can look at different variations of the hormones in your body. So that maybe this is a good segue to move into the saliva and urine testing, which are the other options. And those are pretty common in the functional medicine world. So you might come across those if you're working with a more integrative or holistic practitioner. So in saliva, we're measuring the free and bioavailable hormones as opposed to the protein-bound ones. So that can be really useful, because like I said, we care about total production, but we also care, and it's depending on what's going on, we might care more about what's available to actually exert an effect on the body. And that would typically measure estradiol, which is the main form, the most potent form of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and sometimes things like DHEA and DHEAS. So it gives you somewhat different information from a blood test. And it's also, I think a lot of the pros of it are that you can do it as a cycle mapping test. So you could potentially collect saliva throughout your whole cycle. And then you can get a really nice map of, is your estrogen peaking at the right time? Is your progesterone peaking at the right time? How are they working in concert with each other? Like you're saying, the ratios are very important. And does your progesterone stay nice and sustained through the end of your luteal phase, which is kind of, when we see it drop off too soon, that's when you get a lot of PMS symptoms, all these things we work with all the time with our clients. So I do like salivary panels for that. And, they're super easy. They're not invasive like a blood test. You do them at home. Maybe if I was trying to think of a downside, they can't really measure as many things as blood can. So like in blood, you can measure other factors that are going to affect your hormones, like upstream factors, like do you have enough iron? How's your thyroid doing? What are your pituitary hormones doing, like FSH and LH, because those are important too. So you don't really measure those in saliva very often. There's one test that can measure LH and FSH, I think, by diagnostics, but otherwise the rest have to be done in blood that I mentioned. So what would be another downside? Oh, maybe the cost. You're not, insurance is not going to cover these.
Right.
So, you're typically paying out of pocket, and that can be something like $120 to $300, depending on if you're doing a one-day sample or, the whole cycle. But it is nice that they can also measure cortisol. So if you do samples throughout a day, if you combine like an adrenal salivary panel with a sex hormone panel, then you can see what your cortisol is doing, get a reflection of the HPA axis and how your cortisol rhythm is throughout the day. And we know that those things affect our hormones and our cycles so much. So I like to see those both. And I think that's really a strength of doing salivary testing. And then urine testing, specifically, I'm going to talk about dried urine testing. There is another type of urine testing where you do a 24-hour collection of your total urine production. But I don't know anyone who really does that or uses it. What's far more common is to use the Dutch test, which I know you're a fan of too. And that's a dried urine test. So you pee on a strip of paper, and it's measuring all kinds of stuff. You get so much good info from it. And it's super easy to collect at home, like the saliva. Unlike the saliva, you just let the paper dry, and it's not super time sensitive. You don't need to freeze it. So in a lot of ways, the Dutch is more convenient, I would say, although it is a little more expensive. So that's another thing you're going to be paying out of pocket. And the Dutch is accessible, I think, in all 50 states. Like I live in New York State, where it's very hard to order your own testing if you don't have a provider to do it for you. And the Dutch, because it's dried urine, it doesn't have some of those same restrictions. So anyone can order it anywhere.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know
That's really nice. Yeah. And in addition to giving us a reflection of the free and bioavailable hormones, same as saliva would do, it also gives us a lot of information about how those hormones are being utilized via their metabolites. So how is your body breaking them down and what's happening there? So you just get tons of graphical info. They map it out so well, and I think the strength is you just really get super specific info that you can then use to make a plan. You can tailor it so well. I guess that's a good, does that kind of cover the Dutch test?
Yeah, it does. I want to just go back to, because, you bring up with the saliva and the Dutch. I don't know that everybody understands the connection between cortisol and your sex hormones. And, if you are just doing the blood tests, you're going to miss out on this huge component, right? And so can you explain to people, I know it's kind of in depth, but just a little bit about how your cortisol impacts these other hormones?
Sure. So cortisol, if for people who don't know what it is just a stress hormone secreted by your adrenal glands. And when that's chronically elevated, or, could also be chronically low, we see kind of both of those scenarios a lot. Your HPA axis is off, and your HPA axis is basically the way that your brain, the hypothalamus and pituitary in your brain talk to your adrenals and back and forth. When that's messed up, so is your hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. So there's just no getting around it. That, I know the concept of the pregnenolone steal, where your body diverts resources from reproductive resources to sort of these like stress hormones and fight or flight, is kind of controversial, and we're thinking maybe it doesn't work as simply as we used to think, but I still think it's accurate, and tell me if this is your understanding too, to say that when your body's in a stress mode, in a fight or flight mode, and has been there chronically for a long time, it affects your reproductive hormones and decreases your body's ability. It steals nutrients that you could otherwise be using to, have a healthy corpus luteum and nice mature follicles and a cushy endometrium lining that's, good for conceiving, or not giving you heavy periods or fibroids, or, all these things. So I guess that's the way I would explain it, in simple terms, but I'd love to hear if you want to add anything.
No, I think you did an excellent job. And the reason I brought it up is because I think a lot of women still don't quite understand the connection between stress and the impact on their hormones. I mean, in theory, it's like, oh yeah, I'm, stressed out, and so that's going to impact my body. But people don't know the how and the why. And so it's kind of like seeing those numbers on paper. I think it's really good for women to understand, okay, this is directly what's happening in your body when you're under stress. And like you said, the pregnenolone steal, I know, is up for debate a little bit these days, but I agree that there's no, to me, there's no way that it isn't impacting our progesterone production, over time.
Yeah.
So, and that's where you have so many issues come up, like PMS and,
Yeah. I mean, just one simple example, magnesium. You really burn through magnesium when you're stressed, and you need good solid levels of magnesium to have a healthy cycle, to avoid PMS and, to ovulate regularly,
right.
which is a problem for so many people. Just back to basics.
Yeah.
So I think even just thinking about it in those super simple terms, even if you don't need to understand every biochemical aspect of it,
right.
I think is really helpful.
Right, exactly. So yeah, thank you so much for covering all of those tests. That's really helpful. So do you tend to sort of favor one?
Oh,
go ahead.
one thing I think I didn't say is, like, for salivary and for urine testing, still needs to be done on specific days of your cycle if you want to measure those sex hormones, if you have it, assuming you have a cycle. If you're amenorrheic or if you're postmenopausal, different story. But I just thought maybe I made it sound like blood testing is the only one where you need to do it on a certain day.
Right. Now, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that is something you definitely don't want to waste your money on something like the Dutch and do it on the wrong day. For sure. I absolutely get it. So is there one that you kind of tend to favor in your practice, or, are you just kind of open to what women can do, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I like, it depends on the situation, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. But I do really like, what I love about the Dutch is how easy it is, and that they have a cycle mapping option. I do find cycle mapping just so useful. And for me personally, collecting saliva. So the thing about the saliva test is you can't really, it's not like you're trying to generate saliva. You just have to wait for it to accumulate in order for you to have accurate results. And it's kind of a drag. It's like,
right. I've never thought
like if you're doing, okay, so for a 1 day, for a 1 day sample, or, that's not such a big deal. But if you're doing a whole cycle mapping panel every morning for like 5 minutes, being like, okay, a little saliva into a tube, bummer.
Yeah.
So I love the ease of it. I love the wealth of information you get. Just seeing the window into the HPA axis, and how what your cortisol production is like, how it's being metabolized, meaning like how much is your body actually using and being able to clear. And then I can talk a little bit more about like the metabolites of estrogen and the different pathways those can go down. And testosterone too, which can be really helpful for ladies with PCOS. So all those things, you can kind of take them into account. You can get a picture of things that it's not directly measuring, like your liver function and your thyroid. So that's kind of the beauty of the Dutch test, I would say.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought
that. And then
that.
talking here about the Dutch Complete,
just
so people who might be wondering like which one we're talking about, that's the one that measures your sex hormones and your adrenal hormones.
Right. Good point. Because there are different options on there. If you go to the website, you'll see those. I'm glad you brought that up about testosterone, though, because I think, knowing your DHEA levels and testosterone is also really important, and how the metabolites happen with that, which isn't something that I think every doctor necessarily will think about with women, and so to understand, because things like PCOS are so common nowadays, right? And so to really get a bigger picture of what's going on in your body, it's really amazing that dried urine can tell you all this stuff, right?
Yeah, what a world.
I know, I love it. This is the fun of science these days, right? All the stuff that comes up. Well, I would love for you, since you brought up the term cycle mapping in your last answer, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what cycle mapping is all about, and if you need to do, something like the Dutch in order to do it, or other ways that you can do it.
Yeah, so when you're doing a test and it's a cycle mapping test, that means you're collecting samples throughout your cycle. And usually, it's not usually every day, but it's usually every 2 or 3 days, something like that. And that's a really awesome way for you to see what's happening. Because we know, I mean, most people I think are familiar with the fact that our hormones aren't static throughout our cycle, that they fluctuate and they rise and fall at different times. And so you could, when you measure on one day, you're getting a snapshot of that day, right? And uh, maybe you look great on that day, and that's day 21, but then by day 26, your progesterone's like in the tank,
Yeah.
or your your estrogen's too high compared to your progesterone, or, whatever. So that's where the beauty of the cycle mapping comes in, is you get a more complete picture. So, if someone's open to doing that, I do like that as an option. I mean, I also think, charting your cycle and, measuring your signs of fertility, the primary ones being your basal body temperature and your cervical fluid, is basically doing the same thing. And it's essentially free. So I always call it like the cheapest hormone test there is. And to be honest, I guess I should have said this, when you first asked me, what do I do with people? What's my favorite? That's my favorite. that's what I start with. Well, first I start with the foundations, because I consider hormones more of a downstream effect of these upstream foundational things being out of whack. And that's things like sleep, stress, diet, digestion, those sort of core elements of, like, do you even have the nutrients are you even absorbing them?
Right. You're like, there's
your
no
whole body, yeah.
testing until we figure this part out.
Yeah. So just to clarify for people, I know it's super fun to get test results, and it's really attractive, and especially if you've tried a lot of things, to like, ooh, now you can try this Dutch test. But I really always like to put the brakes on that and say, let's talk about what you've done, what we could do, so that if we do want to do a test, if you do want to go down that route, you're going to get the most useful information you can without all this background noise. And so tracking your cycle, though, is something you can start doing right away, whenever. Yeah, and so that's, like we said, just taking your temperature every morning and tracking your cervical fluid every day. And if you have a cycle, or if you have irregular cycles, if you have any symptoms, it can just be so useful. You can get a wealth of information about how your hormones are doing, and just from that. I mean, the number one thing, and stop me if I'm going on too long, but the number one thing we usually need to know first is, are you ovulating?
Right,
I'm not going to measure your progesterone, if you're not ovulating. Like, that you don't have very much. And that can be answered very simply, with, charting your cycle, taking your temperatures.
So can we walk people through that? Because I know not everybody understands that process, and they're like, okay, I got to take my temperature, but like, what is going to happen? So if you want to take people through that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So typically we think of it in terms of fertility, people trying to determine, am I fertile or am I not? And they're using it for birth control purposes, or for the conception purposes, like trying to time things so that they can get pregnant in a speedy fashion, right? But I guess what I'm trying to do is make the argument that you can use the same technique for health purposes, for health insights. And what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is you get a basal body temperature thermometer, which is different from a regular thermometer. It's a little more sensitive, and you take your temperature every morning, ideally at the same time every morning, and then you note your temperature through your whole cycle. And then the other primary thing that I ask people to do, or I think is really important to do, because it gives great insights about your estrogen levels, is to track your cervical fluid. So for people, who don't know what that is just really secretions from your cervix that give an indication of how fertile or not you are. So, sperm will survive better in a fertile type cervical fluid, and not so great in a not fertile type. And that just is a range from drier, stickier cervical fluid that might leave it like a residue in your underwear, to more stretchy, wet cervical fluid that you might notice when you wipe, like on toilet paper. And so just these things that, I think many of us took for granted as like, oh, why do I have a yeast infection now? Like, what does this, like, I hear people call it discharge all the time.
That is literally what I thought for years.
I
Like,
know. Yeah, me too.
I'd had some yeast issues when I was younger, and I was like, oh, I'm just, and then literally when I figured that out, cervical fluid, I was like, how did I
Yeah,
do
like
this?
just to know what is normal in general, and then what is normal for you is so empowering. I mean, what I love about charting your cycle in this method is that it connects you directly to your body and into understanding your body in a way that like nothing else in my experience has. And taking this thing, our cycle, which a lot of us have come to have really negative feelings about if we have things like pelvic pain or period problems, or it's irregular, we never know when it's going to come. Taking that and shifting it into an empowering mindset or approach to dealing with it is just literally life changing. Like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that.
I love that you brought that up, because I think a lot of women, and I just say that in a wonderful, loving way, is that we are, disconnected from our bodies because there's been so much that has gotten in our way, and has purposefully disconnected us from our bodies. But, we hold so much trauma, particularly, in our reproductive area. And to do something like, charting your cycle and following your cycle really does start to build that trust. So it's not just on this sort of physical level where you're like, oh, that's cool, like, I see this happening. I really think it can heal people on emotional levels and, even spiritual levels too. So it's a pretty profound tool that we have at our disposal that, I know when I first heard about it, I was like, eh. And then when I finally did it, I was like, wow, this really is so cool, so I'm glad that you.
Yeah, I mean, I got into it because I was looking for like quote unquote natural birth control, and I was like, I knew I didn't want to take synthetic hormones, and I didn't really want to get like a copper IUD or anything invasive. And using a barrier method every single day is kind of like a
Yeah.
little bit annoying. Yeah, yeah. And I think this is the reality for a lot of people, and that was kind of my window into it. And then doing it through time and using it as a method of birth control, which, by the way, also a big fan of that, because I think people are scared that it's the rhythm method, and
Right.
this is not. This is a validated way to do to identify when you're fertile, which is a very short window of time, relatively speaking. Uh, it opened my eyes, tracking over several months to, oh, this is when I was stressed out. Look what happened to my chart. Look how it was like all over the place, like, or crossing different time zones, or being sick, or, just trying seed cycling for the first time. I didn't, honestly, when I started seed cycling, which I don't know if that's something your listeners would be familiar with, but just an easy food as medicine technique to help kind of regulate balance hormones, very gentle and usually quite effective. I didn't notice that many changes in my symptoms, but I did notice my chart looked so much more textbook perfect. Like,
Oh, really?
I just had like, I had like the perfect, follicular phase, nice and even, a really clear temperature shift, which is what you're looking for to indicate ovulation. It stayed sustained, nice and long, right until I got my period, instead of a little bit jaggedy or like dropping off
Right.
too soon. And that made me really,
Like, oh, this does work. Because you
yeah,
hear a lot about
yeah. And that made me it really motivated, like we're saying, seeing things on paper or an app in this case,
mm-hmm.
really helped motivate me to stick with something that I knew was good for my body, and then to make adjustments too.
Yeah.
So like if I'm working with someone and they happen to be charting their cycle and we try an intervention, you get feedback pretty quickly about, is this doing what we are hoping it's doing, or is there something else we could incorporate?
Right. And
So that's kind of how
sorry, is it true that our temperature actually goes up the day after we ovulate, or it doesn't when we ovulate?
So my understanding is that a temperature shift will happen sometime between 24 hours, like in that period.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know for sure if that's the same for everyone or if there's some variability. But the reason I know that, like, the reason we wait 3 days to confirm. So you're looking for, in order to confirm ovulation, you're looking for a temperature shift that goes up, and usually it's not even up that much, but when you're charting, you can see the difference very clearly because you're using pretty small increments. So you're looking for a sustained temperature shift over 3 days.
3 days, okay.
And so, yeah, and so that indicates, your follicle has burst out of the corpus luteum, which is the sac that's holding it. And now what's left over becomes this gland called the corpus luteum, and that's making progesterone. And progesterone stimulates your thyroid, so that causes your basal body temperature to go up. So it's this kind of cool chain of events. The exact timing, sorry, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, it's
but
funny,
I know, but that's
that recently,
yeah.
that it was the morning after you ovulated that the temperature actually rises. And I was like, that's interesting.
That's what I think, like taking charge of your fertility, which is like the Bible of fertility awareness method and learning how to track your cycle. I believe that's what it says that you kind of calculate ovulation based on the day before your temperature rises. Mm-hmm. And that's usually supposed to coincide with your peak fertile cervical fluid. Mm-hmm. So another good indication of ovulation. Yeah. I've noticed that when I'm like on point and healthy, that coincides very nicely. Yeah. And so that's like another kind of insight you can get from.
Yeah. So if someone's using this for birth control, purposes, how many days before ovulation, or, would you say, okay, use another method or don't have sex?
Well, I think the most important thing is to say, if you're going to use it for birth control, you need to really know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. If it's important that you don't get pregnant. And that means learning the method. And that, I would say, is separate from tracking for health insights. Mm-hmm. So be clear about what your goal is. And if your goal is to use this as birth control, the studies show that getting trained by a certified fertility awareness educator mm-hmm. is the most effective way to be, to use the method effectively. Because like any other birth control method, there's perfect use rates, which is like, I think it's like 99.6 or something, on par with the pill. And then there's actual use. And so for me, I will say the way that I got comfortable using it is I just wait until I know that I've ovulated, I've confirmed ovulation, mm-hmm. and I don't have any unprotected sex until that point. Mm-hmm. Because I really don't want to get pregnant. And you could ovulate early at any time. I tend to ovulate very early anyway. Good point. So I would never want to, risk it. And I know a lot of women practice it this way. And it takes out, there's so many nitpicky rules in the follicular phase about, is this cervical fluid starting to get fertile? What if I miss it? What if I don't see it on my toilet paper, but it's there, hanging out in my vagina. Yeah. I think that eliminates a lot of, like, you really just have to remember like 2 rules instead of a couple rules. And
that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think a lot of times we just think, oh, this window, that's when we shouldn't, have unprotected sex or whatever, versus like, I mean, how many women are, is the ovulation exactly the same every month? It's, probably not going to happen that often. And so giving yourself that extra to not even tap into it until you've ovulated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's just, it's virtually foolproof that way. And you would just use a barrier method or combination of a barrier method and withdrawal in your fertile phase. But, for me, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for a lot of people, it just eliminates any possibility of error. Yeah. Once you've confirmed ovulation, you cannot get pregnant again. You only release one egg, like you're done and you're good. But for other women, maybe they have a really long follicular phase and it would be a totally different story for them, in which case these rules that are taught in natural family planning method or fertility awareness method or Justice, there's all these different mm-hmm. rules or systems where they have really specific rules. You learn those, and it can be, that might work really well for other people. So
yeah, absolutely. Wow, I know we went off on a tangent there.
I know.
I think that's just as important of information for women to know also, as just what lab testing is about. So thank you for going into that.
Yeah. And I guess I should mention, like, a lot of these tests are not going to be really that useful if you're on hormonal birth control, just as a, side note, since we're kind of on that topic.
Absolutely. That's a really good thing, because I don't know that a lot of people get that mm-hmm. aspect, right? and even maybe some doctors don't know that. So, and I just want to, you know, we talked about this a lot before we got on to this interview, but, you know, especially as women move into perimenopausal years, you know, some of this stuff I think becomes even sort of more important because you're having more of these symptoms, right? These health symptoms, and you really just don't quite understand what is going on in your body. And so, you know, tracking for me now has meant even more than it did before this, you know? I mean, obviously it's important for the birth control aspect of things, but really for understanding what's happening in my body and kind of what its needs are here and there more, you know?
Yeah, really being able to tune in, like you were saying.
Yeah.
I mean, and just, I could give a couple of examples of like the kind of insights you could get from just learning to chart your cycle and doing that consistently. I mean, the length of your follicular phase, which is that first half of your cycle, that tells us, are you making healthy follicles? Are they growing to full maturity? Are you having adequate estrogen levels to make that happen? And, you know, same for the luteal phase, just the length, the number of days of your luteal phase. So that's from ovulation until your next period. So kind of mid-cycle until the end of your cycle. That gives you insights about, do you have a healthy corpus luteum? Is that leftover egg sac essentially making enough progesterone? And often that can be, you can just do simple nutrient interventions like vitamin C, coenzyme Q10, vitamin A, all these things that we know a healthy corpus luteum needs. And you can see those changes in your in the length of your luteal phase and in your temperatures, which are a reflection of your progesterone levels. So, and I just will say for a healthy luteal phase is important for women who are looking to conceive. You can't sustain a pregnancy if you have a luteal phase that's too short, called a luteal phase defect. But it's important for all of us because honestly, you know, this balance of hormones, this balance of estrogen and progesterone in particular is just so important for our cardiovascular health, our brain health, our bone health. So regardless of whether you ever want to conceive, I still think, you know, that's my other quibble with medicine. It's like, it doesn't matter unless you want to get pregnant. I still think it's important to basically act as if, you know, you want to be as fertile as possible, because biologically that just means as healthy as possible.
Right, absolutely. So can you give us, you know, just, I guess, the range of how long the follicular phase should be and versus how long the luteal phase should be?
Well, they say this, you know, this standard cycle that we're all, you know, it's ingrained in us, is a 28-day cycle. And so that day one is the first day of your bleeding, so the first day of your period. And that, in this 28-day cycle, I mean, I don't know that any of my clients have this perfect 28-day cycle, maybe one or two. But in this hypothetical cycle, that would, you know, a good follicular phase, you'd be ovulating kind of right in the middle of the cycle around day 14. So that day 1 through 14 would be your follicular phase. You'd ovulate, and then the rest of your cycle, 14 through 28, would be luteal phase. Follicular phase, I don't think it's as crucial, the amount of time. I mean, it tends to shorten as you get closer to perimenopause and menopause. But the luteal phase is I think more important, that you don't want it too short. If it's too long, it means you're pregnant. So if it goes over 18 days, it's a very good indicator that you're pregnant. And if it's too short, it's an indicator that you're not making enough progesterone. So.
Well, you know, one little tidbit from my personal cycle mapping or just following my cycle the past few months is that I noticed, and it was actually just a couple months ago, I noticed that I was, you know, earlier than I had been the past month, and I went back and on my app and I was like counting the days, and then I went back a month before that, and what I realized is one cycle will be shorter, and then the next cycle will be longer, and then the next cycle will be shorter. And it's like, oh, because the different ovaries, right? So I have one ovary that likes a shorter cycle, and then one that likes, and I went back like 6 months.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, I was like, okay. I mean, you know, with everything my body's been through, there's lots of different things that have happened. But I'm like, was it always that way? I mean, I know at one point it wasn't, because I was definitely, had the same day every month pretty much that my period came, but this was really fascinating for me to figure that out.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I feel like I have something similar where I have an every other ovulation date that kind of shifts right back and forth. I mean, I have no idea if, like, I don't think we really know if we tend to ovulate like every other, but it just kind of intuitively makes sense.
Right. It makes sense, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what app do you use to chart your cycle?
I really like Kindara. That's my
Okay.
favorite.
Okay.
What app do you use?
Well,
Or do
I
you
just use
have?
the Flow Living app.
Mhm.
But I just like write my temperature down in there. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm always curious about, I know there's so many good apps out there. So I was curious what you used.
Yeah. Yeah. I like it. You can track other things and customize it like a journal basically.
Yeah.
And they have a nice tutorial and knowledge base. So that's usually what I suggest people do first. And then what was I going to say? Oh yeah, we talked about that you need a special thermometer to take your
Yes.
temperature. So
Yes.
that's the
And
other
people
thing I
say
usually.
that, can you get those at I don't know, Rite Aid or whatever?
I got my first one at Walgreens and it was like $9.99. So there's a lot of fancy devices and fancy thermometers that will like sync with your phone and all that out there. And for people just getting started, I'm just like, just get the $10 one on the internet and
$9.99 is
start with that.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's so many more things I would love to ask you, but we're definitely coming up here on time. So, do you want to just tell us, like, if you have anything that's coming up, or how people can actually contact you to work with you now that they have heard how amazing you are and all of your knowledge that just blows my mind. So, you want to tell people about
Oh,
that?
I feel like I just was like, whew.
Right?
Hopefully it was digestible.
Oh, it was so
This has been really fun. Thank you. So people can find me on my website, which is just robinrandisi.com. So that's probably the best way to reach me. You can email me. You can find me on social media. My Instagram handle is at robinrandisi. So those two places are probably the best way to contact me in terms of things coming up. I'm working on a group program, like an online course where people can learn to chart their cycles together. So all this awesome stuff we've been talking about, and whether you want to use it for health insights, to conceive, or for birth control purposes, it will be useful to you. So
Oh, I'm
if
so
people
glad
want
you're
to,
doing that. That's awesome.
yeah, I mean, gosh, I've been talking about it for like 3 years, 3 years at least.
The time is right. The time is right.
Yeah, so if people are interested in that, I would steer them towards, reaching out to me, or they can download my quick start guide to charting your cycle, and that will put them kind of in the pipeline to be notified when the course is ready. Of course, if you're not interested in the course, you can still download the freebie, this PDF document, and get started charting your cycle. But it's basically everything I wish I had had in one spot when I started. Just give me the down and dirty. How do I get started? What thermometer should I buy? Okay, go. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And that's something that we'll have in the notes for people to be able to access that freebie from, from watching this and being part of the Hormone Summit. So thank you for letting everyone, have access to that. That's such an amazing, incredible tool. So I'm excited to get it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for putting this summit together. I think people are going to get so much benefit out of it. And I just love your energy and your presence, and I think everyone else will too.
Oh, thank you. And don't forget, you guys, you can work with Robin one-on-one. I can imagine that she changes lives with every person that she works with, because she just understands all of this stuff so well. So don't be afraid to go to her website and check things out. So thanks again for being with me here today. And I will see all of you guys in the next interview. We've got a lot more awesome hormonal experts on tap. So be sure to check your email tomorrow for the next interview. See you guys later.